The title of this panel is America from 1968 to 2018. What's changed, what hasn't, racial justice and the politics of resentment. And the idea behind this panel is not so much to engage in detail with the Kerner Report itself, but rather to think deeply and also holistically about what has changed in our society, and at the same time, what have the continuities been? And in that context, that question, that enormous question, I think, is one that transcends the particular work of the different panelists. I'll introduce the panelists quickly in just a second, but I wanted to give you a sense that the idea behind this panel then is not that each panelist will speak seriatim with their own sort of insights, but rather that we're going to begin with a set of questions, that we're going to have a conversation among the panelists, and that in turn, later on in this period, you too will be invited to join the conversation. There are a couple of microphones, and the panelists will be taking questions. All right. As to the panelists, first we have to my immediate right, Shantel Buggs, professor in the Department of Sociology at Florida State University. She studies multiracial people and their families with special attention to the representation of race, gender, and sexuality in popular culture. And again, these are just going to be super abbreviated introductions. For more, there's longer bios in the program. Eric Tang, professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. He's a former community organizer, and he's working on a book entitled Fire in the Streets, The Long Hot Summer of '67, the Kerner Commission and Racial Liberalism in America. Joining us by video conference from the East Coast is Julian Zelizer, professor of history and politics at Princeton University. His most recent book is The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Also, he wrote an introduction to this reprint of the Kerner Commission report. My name again is Ian Haney Lopez. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley at the law school. I come out of the tradition of critical race theory. That's my primary interest. In 2014, I wrote a book called Dogwhistle Politics. The subtitle was a little bit long. It was Dogwhistle Politics, the coded racism that Donald Trump is about to use to win election. Buy this book to avoid catastrophe, ! But y'all didn't, and here we are. Okay, so the actual subtitle, that was the subtitle that my publisher wished I'd used. But in fact, it was How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class. All right, so here's the first question I want to start with. I'm going to throw it out to all of the panelists. People can jump in and answer as they want. But as I think about what's changed in the last 50 years, to me it's inescapable that we ask that question in terms of the elections of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And I want to start there. You've got these two data points that seem to point in such different directions. What do they tell us about what's changed or the continuities in the country over the last 50 years? What do they ask us to pay special attention to? So the whole law professor thing, right, is you call for volunteers, you wait about 30 seconds, and then you call on somebody. So that's going to be my MO here. But I'll start with any volunteers?
So what's changed? Is that
what's changed? Continuity, Obama, Trump.
Mm-hmm. Well, picking up on the summer of '67, the long hot summer, and then obviously the report which comes out a few months later in '68. I think upon reading the report, what becomes abundantly obvious to me is that those who participated in the unrest, and I'm going to call them protesters, those who engaged in violent tactics during the summer of '67 were by and large people who were well-educated, employed, and altogether hopeful about their situation. if you read the profile of a typical quote-unquote rioter, you find that, again, on the whole, they were folks who participated in other movements during the 60s. And one of the things that I see coming out of this moment is something very similar, that what we saw in Ferguson isn't a expression of blind rage or hopelessness, but a well-organized, deliberate, purposeful set of actions taken by people who were politically informed, obviously, but also hopeful. So that's one parallel that I see upon reading the Kerner Commission report today.
So I'm going to just stay with you for a second, Eric. It seemed to me that you kind of skipped over Trump and Obama, but really wanted to talk about social movements. And I think that social movements question is a hugely important question. So stay with it for just a second. How do you think social movements today and in the late 1960s then compare? I mean, you've mentioned this hopefulness. Are there similarities? Are social movements today primarily racial? Are they primarily black-led? Have they changed? Are there different sorts of social movements? What are the linkages? Any thoughts there?
Well, clearly the movements have evolved. They've articulated in different identity formations, and so and that's going to happen over the course of 50 years. That's so there's that changing same, as it were. But there's a certain kind of consistency I see with respect to strategies and tactics. The Kerner Commission report identified different types of urban unrest events, and the most severe was known as a major disorder, right? A major disorder was one that lasted multiple nights, where a number of people participated across different parts of the city, and which ultimately required the National Guard's intervention, okay? But within that category, there are 8 different events, and what they share isn't so much severity, because what happened in Detroit and Newark really doesn't compare to what happened in Tampa, which is also a major disorder. Rather, I think the common element between these 8 events is about strategies and tactics, that somehow the people were organized enough in those 8 cities to get out in front of the police on that first critical night to gain leverage, which then they were able to take advantage of over subsequent nights. I saw the same thing happen in Ferguson. And so again, what I see is more the consistency around organization and strategies and tactics over the course of 50 years. If something has changed, though, it is the criminalization of black activism. The way in which the people in Ferguson were criminalized in a way which was in some ways similar to what we saw in '67, but also at a whole other level of intensity and abstraction, and we could talk more about that. I won't belabor that point right now, but I think that if I could say one thing about the Kerner Commission, I think the Kerner Commission is largely responsible for the criminalization of black activism over the course of the past 50 years as well. But let's park that for now. Let's park that.
Say something controversial and then say, well, we'll park that. Let me come back then to this question, Julian or Shantel, on Obama, Trump.
I think the dual nature of the moment that you're talking about between 2008 and 2016, meaning the election of Obama and the election of Trump with such different trajectories, that was obviously right there in the 1960s as well. And so the Kerner Report comes after several rounds of progress on civil rights legislation with many shortcomings and many limitations, but nonetheless historic, 64 and 65. And you were dealing with a president, Lyndon Johnson, who was struggling by 1968 to maintain and to preserve the domestic initiatives that he had. And the reason was not simply the kind of breakdown over the Vietnam War, but one of the things I've tried to highlight was this growing strength of conservatism on Capitol Hill, white backlash politics, both on Capitol Hill and at the grassroots level that Republicans capitalized on in 1966, the backlash against an open housing bill that Johnson had proposed, and then again in 1968 when Nixon packages this as a law and order campaign, which is clearly his response, his Kerner Report, to what had happened in cities like Detroit and Newark. And for me, Donald Trump, President Trump, clearly comes out of a trajectory of conservatism, part of conservative politics, which was very much there when this report came out. And it was very much part of the reason, and I'm sure there's probably disagreements on the panel, but part of the reason in which the recommendations the commission did make were probably not going to go very far regardless of what the president did. But I think it's important to not individualize Trumpian politics on these issues, meaning to put him in a 50-year pattern of racial politics that has had a profound effect and has been part of American conservatism during this period.
Shantel, did you want to come in?
I'm still actually just like ruminating on this criminalization of Black activism. So I'm just going to try to park that. I plan to come back to it. We'll come back to it. I guess I'm trying to think about not only, I guess, thinking about what has changed right in the last 50 years that we get Obama and then we get Trump. I mean, I agree that I don't think that Trump is necessarily new. I think he is playing on white fears in a way that many other politicians have done so before. I think he does it in a less polished way that perhaps makes it seem like it's more I don't even want to say innovative. I really don't know what to call it. I think I have a hard time thinking about, I guess, what has changed, because even with the so-called many changes, right, that came with Barack Obama's election, I think there were still a lot of things that remained the same. I think about, certain stances that Obama would take on, so things like rioting and calling them thugs. There was a certain respectability to the things that even President Obama kind of expected from Black people who were trying to agitate for attention to inequality. And he would say things like, "I'm the president of all America, not just Black America." So I think even as we certainly can celebrate the things that I think he did that were in line with this legacy of the Kerner Commission, I think we also need to contend with the fact that there were a lot of things he did, I think, and not just him, right, as an individual. I think we can talk about how the whole Democratic Party also contributes to this, right, undermining, right, the recommendations of the Kerner Commission and undermining the efforts of activists and other people, right, who are trying to advocate for change. So I think we want to be careful about setting up this dichotomy, right, between Obama as the ultimate good and Trump as the ultimate bad, because at the end of the day, Barack Obama was, a moderate centrist, right? He wasn't some, super left liberal, and perhaps, he was not leading the call, right, to right, I guess, further, right, certain kinds of racial tension, particularly in, impoverished communities in the United States. But this is still someone, right, who was engaging in drone warfare and was maybe not bombing, right, the Black and brown bodies in this country, but was doing it elsewhere. So I think also when we think about kind of what's changed, I'm also, I guess, thinking about kind of the more globalized world we've become, and the ways in which a lot of the movements, particularly I think the Black Lives Matter movement, right, have become these much more global conversations. And I think even with Trump, we have to think about not just a rise of right-wing politics in the United States, but more globally. Right, we see it in the UK with Brexit. We see it in France. We're seeing it in Germany. We're seeing this in a lot of places. So I think there's like this global component to it now that perhaps I don't think was as strong, even in the midst of being in the Vietnam War 50 years ago. So that would be my.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And so clearly you've sort of touched a chord with the audience. I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator and come in and actually participate substantively. So I think if we think about Obama marks some really important developments, but then, as you say, he carries with him some significant limitations. Maybe limitations is actually the wrong word. Some significant commitments of his own that I think ill-serve the project of racial equality and also wealth equality in this country. So I would say of Obama, he really reflected the rise of norms of racial egalitarianism, especially in elite spaces, especially among a significant segment of the white population, not a majority, but a significant segment, I think especially elite coastal whites. And I think he also sort of represented significant advances in development of a black middle class and a sort of a middle class and an elite of people of color. And he was really able to capture this sense of having gotten past race, of post-racialism. And with that was able to cobble together an electoral majority that included a plurality, but not a majority of whites, and significant numbers of people of color, supermajorities of people of color. But I think Obama remained committed to a couple of ideas. One was that we should not talk about race, that we as a society were in the process of transcending race most successfully by not addressing it nationally. And that there was an underlying politics of racial fear among whites that Obama felt that he had to manage. And in some sense, he managed it with respect to African Americans by staying largely quiet about the plight of African American communities. But much more to his discredit, he managed that white anxiety around questions of immigration by launching the largest, the highest sustained levels of deportation this country has ever seen. That is, he put brown bodies, sort of at the service, the dehumanization and brutalization of brown bodies at the service of appeasing white anxiety about the changing racial complexion of the country. I also think that Obama personally was not committed to a program of using government to radically redistribute wealth in this country, and that instead he was more or less personally, as well as I think politically, strategically committed to a project of neoliberalism, of limiting the role of government to facilitating the market, and of seeing as the market as the greatest engine for the achievement of social good. And I think especially in the wake of partly in the wake of the Great Recession, that seemed a terrible blunder. But even more, I would say, we need to read that commitment to neoliberalism against what had happened in the country over the last 50 years, and against the sort of pro-government activist solutions that were articulated in the Kerner Commission report. Because 50 years ago, we were coming out of the experience of the New Deal, and the experience of the New Deal was, the central lesson of the New Deal was, activist government has a central role to play in regulating the market, in progressive taxation, and taxing the rich, and taxing corporations, enforcing wealth and power downward and outward in order to create routes of upward mobility to facilitate the largest expansion of the middle class the world had ever seen, limited in the period from the 30s through the mid-60s to whites. And with the Kerner Commission, the idea was break that color bar on activist government. Let activist government play a role in creating a shared economic prosperity that includes people of color. And it's precisely the ability of conservative reactionary forces to use race not just to win elections. And that is clear, and we should remember, Lyndon Johnson is the last Democratic candidate to win a majority of the white vote. Not since 1964 has any Democrat won a majority of the white vote. But the point of dog whistling, of using race, was not just to win elections, but it was to convince a majority of whites that people of color and government in service to people of color was the biggest threat in their lives, and to turn many whites against the idea that government has a role to play in promoting economic equality for everybody. And it's that shift that that helps us make sense of the way in which, from 1970 to today, we've seen dramatic increases in wealth inequality that hurt everyone, including many whites. So much so that we have levels of wealth inequality we haven't seen since before the Great Depression. That's part of the racial politics of the last 50 years, a racial politics that uses race to scare people, not just against people of color, but against the idea of a shared public program, government for everybody, right? And it's that commitment that Obama himself didn't challenge either. Okay, so now,
Could I just jump in for 1 second? You know, I think it's important. I just finished a book. I edited a book on Obama that's coming out next week. And I do think it's important that we don't flatten the political landscape so much that we miss some of the changes that do happen in his administration. I don't think, for example, ACA, especially the expansion of Medicaid, is insignificant in talking about efforts to diminish inequality. It was a very serious government initiative. It had pretty big effects on health care coverage for low-income people. The economic stimulus also was a pretty big program, and that economic revival did have benefits, and we're seeing some of them now. They're not radical, they're not as complete as they have to be, but they weren't nothing. And also Department of Justice initiatives toward the end of the administration under Holder were trying to deal with some of the issues that had emerged in ways that are totally absent right now with the current administration. And coupled with that, we do have to remember, and this gets back to the Kerner Report and the politics of '68, gosh, the environment that Obama was governing under after 2010 had shifted not a little to the right, it had shifted far to the right. It was setting up the conditions to elect the current president of the United States. And so some of this I don't think was all a choice of his neoliberalism or his hesitance. He was dealing with an environment where I'm not sure how much more he was really going to get from the Congress. I would just throw that into the mix of trying to think about where President Obama's administration fits in this long history.
Yeah, but on the question of racial justice, specifically on the question of insurgent white rage in the United States, I think it's true enough that the Obama administration didn't just stay muted on this question. They actually suppressed, or in some instances apologized for some of the research that they were producing around how insurgent this movement was. So I believe the Department of Justice did release a report early on in his administration. I think it was during the first term, which showed that that white supremacy was on the rise and correlated it with his presidency. He came under so much political pressure that his administration decided to withdraw the report and tacitly apologize for it, even though they didn't find anything wrong with the methodology or the data. And I think it's this decision to not just not talk about white rage, but actively suppress it that contributes to the Trump moment. And you see a parallel too in 1967 and 68. One of the things that I think is remarkably missing from the Kerner Report, despite its hundreds of pages, is the presence of what Carol Anderson, I should cite, who I'm, term properly, what historian Carol Anderson describes as white rage. So if you look at these cities which burned, what you notice is that these neighborhoods were bordered by majority white ethnic neighborhoods, which suggests that every day there was this antagonism, this conflict happening on a day-to-day level between African-American residents and white residents, which fomented the unrest. And this makes sense when we read some of the relative deprivation sociology. Like, the reason why cities erupt is not because blacks and whites are segregated, but because they're actually dealing with each other day to day. So the presence of white rage is there in these cities, and yet the Kerner Report doesn't really pick up on this. And even if you look at some of the photojournalism from '67, right? The only white people you see are National Guardsmen and police officers, but not these neighboring white ethnics who were day-to-day engaged in issues of civilian on civilian racial violence with African Americans. So that suppression of the facts, the suppression of white rage, I think is another parallel between 67, 68, 2017, 2018.
Shantel?
No, I mean, I think that that's a great point that you bring up, especially since I'm thinking back to, when we're talking about integration of schools, and you have that visibilization, particularly, right, of white womanhood, right, kind of expressing this anger and rage, right, with little black girls, right, just trying to go to school. And yeah, I can't recall really seeing even those same kinds of images, like a decade later, right, following the passage of the Civil Rights Act. It's like with that passage, it's like, okay, you got your act, you have your civil rights, so now we're not gonna show how white people, right, are also like not just oppressing you in the form of being agents of the state, right, but average everyday people can also engage in this oppression as well. Which is also interesting to me too, because I'm thinking, I've been sitting here, right, kind of like listening to all of this, and I keep thinking about Indigenous people. And, right, the ways in which a lot of these struggles are happening on stolen land, a lot of the things that we're seeing happening to Black communities in the past and continuing are also, right, still happening to Indigenous people. So for instance, what is it that's going on? The thing with food, they're wanting to put together, right, boxes of food items, right, and say these are the things you have to eat if you're going to be on, TANF or WIC or whatever it is, right? And that's a program that's been in place with, on reservations for decades. So it's interesting to me the ways in which, like a lot of the things we're talking about, right, are also happening to Indigenous communities. We're also seeing that white rage and that the rage of the state being enacted on Indigenous communities. We saw it, very alarmingly at Standing Rock. The kinds of violence, police brutality that we see against Black people, we also see, right, at disturbingly high rates among Indigenous people. And so I'm also wanting us, I guess, to kind of think about, particularly, right, as we're thinking about how things have changed, I feel like there is more pressure and expectation for these movements, right, to kind of unify, right, across oppressed peoples. Which is why, again, I think that things like the Black Lives Matter movement, right, create these links with people in Palestine, right, and become this much bigger global thing, because we're talking about, right, things that are happening, right, in a larger settler colonial structure where, right, all different kinds of oppressed peoples, right, are dealing with these struggles. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there too, because it's been weighing on me. Yeah, but.
So I guess I want to be clear, and I don't think this panel should devolve into sort of a micro-analysis of the Obama administration. I do take Shantel's point that we shouldn't hold up the Obama administration as like everything that's right about what we're doing and Trump is everything that's wrong. Well, we can hold up Trump as everything that's wrong, but we shouldn't do Obama as everything that's right. But I also take Julian's point to be right that we have to understand what Obama was doing in the context, the political context as he understood it. So okay, I want to leave that aside. We can return to it later, certainly as the audience becomes involved. But I wanted to pick up on this idea of what happened with the criminalization of African Americans and how that was connected to civil rights. The South learned that they lacked moral legitimacy if they said they were going to fight freedom fighters or they were going to lock up freedom fighters, they were going to lock up people demanding human rights and human dignity. But that they gained legitimacy if they said they were going to fight lawbreakers, that the problem was these criminals who didn't respect law and order. And so that language of law and order became a proxy language by which white reactionary forces could express their violent reaction in seemingly neutral, seemingly legitimate language. And in turn, that became part of the coded language of Dogwhistle Politics, law and order, crime in the street, thugs. innocent victims, the thin blue line between civilization and savagery. That became the political discourse of the 60s and the 70s, and then through the 80s and the 90s up until the present. And certainly you hear it in Trump's political rhetoric. None of that says on its surface race, but underneath it, of course, it's a story of depraved and violent black people and whites as innocent, pure, and likely victims. It wasn't just the right, though, that was using that language. Bill Clinton in the 90s realized that if he were to get elected, he had to pick up as many white votes as possible. He didn't manage to pick up a majority, but he came close, and he came close by campaigning to end welfare as a way of life, where implicitly it was a way of life of African Americans, and also to crack down on crime. And again, that was he was simply picking up on Reagan's themes. And I think, and Michelle Alexander makes a very powerful case that Bill Clinton did much more damage in terms of a war on crime than even Reagan. But what happened was you had the Democrats and the Republicans essentially engage in a bidding war to show racially anxious whites who could more violently suppress the black community. And so when we think about racialized mass incarceration, which is the incarceration vote, if you think about street violence by the police against black communities, part of that story is surely prejudice. Part of it is surely structural in terms of segregation and lack of jobs. But we should also be clear, our politicians have been asking the police to act as the violent arm of white racial fear. That's what our politicians ask the police to do. And so we can't understand mass incarceration without understanding this appeal to white violence. And the only thing I'd say here to bring it up to contemporary times is the rhetoric of white fear has changed, I think, since 9/11. It's not now primarily about black crime, but also about dark foreign others infiltrating our country, possessed of lethal cultures, and that can be Muslim, or it can be illegal aliens and Mexicans, but there's developed a very strong racial rhetoric that extends Dogwhistle Politics from a fear of African Americans to a fear of Latinos, a fear of Muslims, right? And so there really is this sort of, the black-white paradigm remains key, but we can't stop with an analysis of race that looks only at how African Americans are treated. We really need to think about how sort of white racial fear has morphed to centrally include Latinos and Muslims, and then also the way I think it's playing out in terms of indigenous relations also.
Mm-hmm. So are we coming back to the criminalization?
Come on back.
Okay. So just the one thing that so you noted, Eric, that the Kerner Commission kind of set this turn in the criminalization of black activism. For me, I guess I would argue that black activism has always been criminalized. I mean, if we go back, right, to any kind of resistance under chattel slavery, I mean, that was criminalized, right? It's not like, Harriet Tubman was not, right, kind of seen as
Slavery. Abolitionism.
A threat in a variety of ways. So, I mean, I think that perhaps we can sit here and we can maybe kind of try to construct a more, I guess, kind of wide umbrella, more encompassing vision of what counts as activism, right? And think about the ways in which people, living in very oppressed circumstances, right? Just their resistance to that circumstance is in itself activism, and the ways in which that certainly has been criminalized historically. But I do think it is interesting in the kind of the last 100 years, particularly the last 50, where we definitely see this perception, not just in the media, but from kind of a legal standpoint, right, that, going out and this idea of peaceful protest. I've been thinking about this a lot coming from Florida, where, the Parkland shooting just happened, and these amazing high school students are, organizing and coming up to the Capitol in Tallahassee, and they're protesting, and everyone is talking about how amazing it is, and George Clooney is giving them money, and there's all of this support, right? And a lot of people are, noting the connections behind the fact that this, not to say, right, that it's a strictly white-led, student movement with these Parkland students, but they're definitely not as Black and as threatening as the Ferguson or Baltimore. A lot of teenagers and young people who were a part of those movements, leading those movements, organizing on Twitter and social media, really pushing these conversations. And so there's this whole notion of peaceful protest, and what does peaceful protest look like? And the idea that if you protest peacefully, it'll be more palatable. And so now all these universities are coming out and saying, oh, if you get suspended or expelled from school for peaceful protest, we won't count that against you when you apply here. And I'm like, well, what about the kids in Ferguson and in Baltimore and in Sanford and all of these other places, right, who were protesting their condition, protesting, in honor of Mike Brown and Trayvon and all of these other people, right? But they got arrested. Some of them are dead, right? The number of these activists who've been found dead in cars and various other bizarre circumstances. So I feel like there is not only, right, this kind of way in which we are pitting so-called bad, right, protesting against so-called peaceful protesting in the kind of broader rhetoric, but in the ways in which that framing allows us to throw certain people, right, in jail, right, to try to silence them and to basically to disrupt their movements. And that's been a big part of how, right, the government has operated, right, in trying to silence Black activism, is throwing people in jail.
And just to jump in on that point, initially the Kerner Report did aim to rebut that kind of argument, which had been common in government reports about urban violence. And in 1965, I believe it came out, John McCone had done a report, I think it came out in 65, or I can't remember, early 66, about the Watts conflict. And the big theory the government commissions always latched onto was the quote-unquote riffraff theory of why these happened. It was delinquents in the city who were causing violence and causing trouble, or it was outside agitators, radicals who were coming in simply to stir up the community. And it may be unsuccessfully, but one of the hopes of the Kerner commissioners and the social scientists and lawyers working on it was to offer a different take on that, and that's why the report stressed that many of the people involved in the confrontations in Detroit and in Newark were middle class, often educated, and very cognizant of the conditions that they faced and why they were doing this. So just reading the report suggests there's a long history, even within government commissions, of treating, of criminalizing African American protest.
And so I totally agree with your point. Clearly, the criminalization of Black activism is centuries old. But if we look at the Black freedom movement during the 1960s, there's this moment where the activists are able to take this question of crime and turn it on its head, right? So King is writing the letter from a Birmingham jail, right? And he's winning because he's writing from a jail and no one is thinking he's a criminal. Some people are, but for the most part, he's winning, right?
Yeah.
And King is an interesting figure in 1967, leading up to the Long Hot Summer, because he gives this speech in April of '67 against the Vietnam War, right? It's called Beyond Vietnam, and he comes out strong against the war. And in that speech, he says, how could I possibly tell these young people in cities across the United States to not pick up a Molotov cocktail, to not pick up a rock, and to be nonviolent when their government is the largest perpetrator of violence in the world. And so what he's saying is, I'm not going to condemn the protests that are violent. I'm not going to support it, but I also don't condemn it. And so there's a moment here where people are seeing the young folks in Watts, in Rochester the summer before that, not necessarily as criminals, but as protesters. What I would argue is that after King's assassination and after the Kerner Report becomes a national bestseller, over the next decade, we lose that. That what King had tried to do in April of '67, right, create an opening for us to understand what happened in Watts as quote unquote legitimate protest and activism, ultimately gets criminalized. leading us up to the present moment.
So, I am going to ask a couple more questions, but I wanted to signal that once I ask those, that I'm then going to turn to the audience. There's a couple of mics here, so be thinking about what you might want to ask, and if you do want to ask something, please go ahead and start lining up. Okay, as I think about sort of 68 to 2018, or I should say, as I think about 2018 and going forward, it seems to me that there are a couple of big questions for us, and one is the social movement question. And in terms of the social movement question, it seems like, you know, in 68, there was a sort of a third world movement, an effort to push cross-racial solidarity among people of color. Seems like that is even more important now, even more foregrounded. It also seems to me that you think about something like Black Lives Matter, you think about the Dreamers. I think the young activists today are much more committed to a sort of an intersectional approach that says we can't tackle race separate from gender, separate from sexual orientation, separate from class inequality. So one question is, how do you form a sort of an effective coalition? How do you form cross-racial solidarity among people of color? As one big question. Here's the other big question. The death knell of civil rights, the limit on the Kerner Commission report was white racial backlash. How has white racial anxiety changed or persisted? What forms does it take? Has there been a bifurcation? Is this a phenomena of some whites but not others? And if so, which whites are most deeply committed to racial reaction? For which whites is it less of an issue? And partly this is a sort of a progress question, a sort of a loving integration, mixed race, and then also it's what the hell is the alt-right? And how did they come to not only be so powerful in terms of social media, but to occupy central positions in the White House? Right? And so I want to just sort of put both of those questions out to the panel, one or both. Social movements, cross-racial solidarity. What has changed in terms of white racism, its forms, its prevalence? I'll throw those out. 30 seconds or less, please.
I think I just wanted to throw, I think that, King's comments about the white moderate being what stands in the way of a lot of these movements is still true. I think that people still want things to not be about race. People want to say it's about class or it's about these other things when race is still at the heart of it. And I think that part of the ways in which we've done a disservice, I think, as a society are because we let states like the state of Texas determine what goes in textbooks. And so the textbooks tell our kids that, enslaved people just came over here because they wanted to work, and that Native Americans kindly gave away their land to the Pilgrims. And so, I'm thinking about how, decades of that kinds of socializing, right, and that kind of whitewashing of racial tension in this country, also helps to set up, this kind of colorblind logic that permeates where we're at now. People have a very hard time, I think, the average person, right, has a very hard time understanding that racism is not just the overt, the blatant burning a cross on your lawn, right, that racism happens in these very everyday, minute things. It happens in the way that you express preferences for who you want to date. It happens in the ways that you completely will filter out, right, people of color off your online dating website. It happens in the ways that you maybe don't want to live in a certain neighborhood because too many people, right, who might bring your property values down live there. And so I think until we can do some kind of just retraining, I think, of the average everyday person and their understandings about race and what racism looks like, I think we're gonna have a very hard time getting a majority of white people, I think, to sign on, right, to to a kind of a revamping of how race works in the U.S.
So you're less concerned with a sort of like the alt-right, and you started by saying the white moderate.
I mean, because the thing is it's not like, again, the alt-right isn't new. Like, there's always been these people.
Yeah, but they haven't sat in the White House. You know what I mean?
Yes, they did. Well, who was it that said that Birth of a Nation was like history written in lightning?
Sorry.
Wilson, right? Yeah, and perhaps not as blatant and as avowed as the people that we have in the White House now. Perhaps that's true. But again, I think that when we focus on the people who, like, we're not going to get them to change, right? Those people, right, are always going to be the enemy, quite frankly, right? Those are not the people who we're going to get to be a part of this cross-racial coalition, right? We need the white moderates to come be a part of this coalition, but we need them to be as invested in it as they are invested in their whiteness.
Okay.
Real quickly, Tampa, Florida was the only major disorder to happen in '67 in a former Jim Crow city. So all the other cities were in the urban north, but Tampa was the only one in which Jim Crow was statutory at some level. And this begs the question, did Tampa burn because of Jim Crow, because of this strident kind of white supremacist color line, or despite it? And all evidence points to the latter, that it wasn't the kind of rigid Jim Crow regime which was so, abhorrent that led African Americans to rebel, but rather it was the way in which Jim Crow was practiced with more nuance, complexity. In other words, the way in which Jim Crow found a natural ally in the kind of racial liberalism which governed Tampa during that period. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so, to me, the question isn't about degrees of severity, which white supremacy is worse.
Yep.
I don't really think that helps. The question is, which forms of white supremacist governance is most damaging at a particular moment, right? And what the people of the summer of '67 taught us was that it's actually racial liberalism which is more damaging in this moment. And that's the lesson that I would take away from 50 years ago.
Interesting. Julian, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would just add, I think those were all very thoughtful responses, and the nub of the report was, it wasn't simply about the ideologies of different political actors. It was about dealing with institutional racism. I mean, that was the concept the Kerner Commission really wanted to push onto the table, which I think in general has fell, unfortunately, by the wayside in the last 50 years. There are certain areas, there's more progress in others. I mean, you could make a case that in education, there's been more progress than in the criminal justice system, for example. But overall, I think if you read the Kerner Report from '68, that basic problem has not been part of our political dialogue. And it's part of a broader political shift that affects all kinds of issues, other kinds of economic issues as well, our kind of resistance at looking at the institutional roots of some of our political dilemmas. And on your first question, I think that's a really important one in terms of thinking of social movements. And one of the things that's always striking, in addition to kind of cross social groups, social group movement activism, is cross-organizational activism. I mean, the high point of the civil rights movement in the early '60s was characterized by organizations with pretty different agendas, certain unions, certain religious organizations, and then pure civil rights organizations came together through the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, for example, umbrella groups like that. And I think that's important. There's been a fragmentation of political activism that I think undermines some of the ability of any of the pieces of these movements to achieve what we saw in the early 1960s. So activists who are focused on immigration rights now and the Black Lives Matter movement, there are coalitions that I think really need to be built given what they are trying to be a counterweight to, which is a very entrenched conservative movement that has a lot of institutional resource and muscle.
Yeah, great. So I want to, it's not that often that I end up being like the racial liberal on a panel. So let me struggle through this moment. Let me come back to this question of, I think, what's happened with white racism, because I think it makes sense to say, look, we know that there's a big racial sorting that's going on in terms of our political parties. The Republicans today draw over 90% of their support from white voters. A far lesser percent among Democrats. But it's not just a racial sorting. I think there's, among whites, there's what we might call a racism sorting. That when you look at what happened in the 2016 election, whites who shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party were the more racially fearful whites. Whites who shifted from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party were the less racially fearful, the ones who measured lower in terms of racial anxiety. When you look at questions like, is discrimination against African Americans or discrimination against whites a bigger problem? There used to be a significant gap among African Americans in the Democratic Party and whites in the Democratic Party. That gap has narrowed substantially. So there is a significant segment of whites who feel very differently than the majority of whites about racism and really believe in the project of racial egalitarianism, believe in affirmative action, believe in reform of the criminal justice system, believe in a pluralist immigration system, right? So I think we need to pay attention to that, even as there remains a pattern, even among these, let's say, white liberals, that is resistant to foregrounding issues of racial justice, or to thinking about what's happening in society in terms of race. So that's the good news. Here's what I think is the bad news, and I really want to contrast this with colorblindness. I think what we're seeing develop now is an increasing sense, and there's been some research on this that suggests we're talking about 3 out of 5 whites, an increasing sense among about 3 out of 5 whites who think of themselves as white, and I want to contrast this with colorblindness. So the colorblind response to the civil rights movement was really a response that said, hey, okay, I understand white supremacy is immoral. I won't be an open advocate of white supremacy. I'll instead endorse colorblindness, and here's the bargain of colorblindness. I won't endorse white supremacy. You don't talk to me about affirmative action or racism, right? And so colorblindness was it was a partial step forward, but it came at a cost of we can't really address racism this way through colorblindness. But colorblindness has to be seen, I think, as an improvement over open endorsement of white supremacy. What's happening now is a significant number of whites are moving away from colorblindness. And they're starting to say, I'm white, being white is important to me. Whites are just another minority group like every other minority group. Whites need to band together politically to defend their interests, and I am in no way a racist, and I don't like the Klan. Like that whole complex set of meanings, right? And when I say we haven't had someone from the alt-right in the White House, I mean it in that second sense, and I mean it in the sort of post-civil rights era. We've had a number of whites, Nixon, Reagan, Nixon especially, a real bigot. But Trump is in this alt-right, whites are in a sort of death fight to defend themselves against increasing numbers of people of color. Whites are the real victims. Whites have to band together. Whites need to mobilize politically. That's a sort of, I think, a hardening mindset a hardening mindset among many people who insist they're not racist. And I think one of the big challenges of the political moment is how do we, it's not just solidarity with sort of white liberals, but if 60% of whites are moving to a sort of, to making white racial consciousness and solidarity central to their identity, that's going to be a huge problem for the country. And how do we think about that? How do we deal with it? And let me just say, we're really happy to keep talking if nobody has any questions from the audience, but if people do have questions from the audience, now is the time to come to the mic.
So I'm curious about how you're conceptualizing colorblindness now, because, I mean, if we look at Bonilla Silva's, right, kind of these discourses around colorblindness, right, and this colorblind ideology, whiteness is still a big part of how that colorblindness operates, right? I mean, there's the whole racial stories and right coming up with these examples, right, of how white people have lost out on jobs or opportunities or have lost XYZ, right, to black people. And so I don't think whiteness, right, isn't central to that ideology or that rhetoric or that discourse. And I am very concerned about framing colorblindness as an improvement over this blatant racism. And that concerns me because I think we when we start trying to really nuance racism, right, and we start talking about all these different kinds, we talk about our benevolent racism, our colorblind racism, our scientific racism, right, all the flavors of racism, I think we end up doing ourselves a disservice. And so, yes, I think it is very critical that we think about the fact that people who are not only ineptly unqualified for the positions that they are fulfilling, right, but they're using it, right, to pursue their blatantly white supremacist agendas. I think that is certainly important, and we need to think about that. But I think they still are able to do it through a colorblind discourse, right? They still get to use this language of saying, I'm not a racist, and they'll use all of these turns of phrase, right, and these strategic moves to make themselves not sound racist, even as they're saying things that are blatantly racist. And I think my biggest concern, right, with considering colorblindness an improvement is that, right, colorblindness helps to hide a lot of the insidiousness, and I don't necessarily see that as an improvement, right, if we're trying to, right, work towards justice for not just across racial lines, but gender lines, sexual orientation, class, all of these things. When we're talking about people using these coded, hidden discourses and logics and embedding it in the policy that they write, all of these things, I don't see that as an improvement. To me, that makes it harder to challenge, harder to undo. To me, it makes it a more strong and adept opponent than white supremacy that's blatant.
And if I could just real quickly, what you described, Ian, is actually, I'm not saying you were saying this is new, yeah. But for me it's very familiar because it kind of typifies whiteness from Queens, New York, where I'm from and where Trump is from. And so this is something that I find to be disorienting about the current Trump moment, is that we don't attribute it to its New York roots. And I have a story about Fred Trump, his father, which I'll tell in private after this panel. Growing up, and as a teaser, he used to pull up in his Rolls Royce and ask us while we were playing basketball if we would put flyers on cars for him, because he was trying to recruit specifically white ethnics into his apartment buildings. But anyway, after the panel, we'll talk more. So what did we learn from New York during the 80s and 90s when this is on the rise? What we learned is that the politics of conversion really isn't the strategy. The only strategy is robust social movements which push back consistently.
All right, let me, Julian, unless you want to come in, I'm going to turn to the questions. All right, go, sir.
Yes, hi. Thank you for this excellent panel. I've really appreciated it. And Shantel, if you do not have a fan club, I'd like to start one.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
I am a minister, and so I'm specifically going to ask you about the New Poor People's Campaign and Reverend Dr. Barber. His book, The Third Reconstruction, I grew up in Virginia in the 1960s, so I pretty much learned that slavery wasn't all that bad. And I watched Gone with the Wind several times, and I learned that the carpetbaggers were evil people who, shouldn't be involved. And Barber's book on the Third Reconstruction really has opened my eyes in a number of ways to what actually happened after the Civil War. And since we've had 50 years since the Kerner Commission report, I'm particularly interested in what you think we might learn from the 50 years after the Civil War about all the pushback that came from the Klan and the White Citizens Council.
Do we want to just have people ask questions or answer as they go?
No, I think answer as they go.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great question, and I think you.
So yes on the fan club?
I love fan clubs. Who doesn't love fan clubs? Academic Beyonce. That's who I'm trying to be. No, so I mean, I think you bring up a good point, and I think there are a number of other people, right, who kind of talk about we can look to the past for examples, right? So we can talk about Reconstruction, right, as a way in which the government actually was, right, trying to implement policy, right, and actively trying to undo, right, some of the legacy of slavery, right, after, right, emancipation. And that didn't, Reconstruction didn't last very long. And then we undo any of the advances that happened during Reconstruction with various other right kinds of policy. So I think it really demonstrates for us the ways in which, even if, say, right, the Kerner Commission, right, was able to maybe achieve something, which would have been great, and maybe, right, we would be in a different place. But who's to say, right, that history wouldn't repeat itself? And right, we might see prosperity, right, and actual changes, right, for a certain period of time that perhaps, depending on the possibilities, as John was talking about earlier, right, that might get rolled back. I think we're seeing that right now with the rolling back of Voting Rights Act and various other kinds of policy. So I think that looking to the past, I think, is always important and useful, and kind of remembering that. People have kind of gone through some iteration of these things before, and maybe looking about what we can try to do different.
I'm particularly interested in thinking about the violence that was created by the White Citizens Council and the Ku Klux Klan to destroy the Fusion Party and the opportunities for blacks and whites to work together, especially considering class issues.
So one of the things that I'd say, I think Reverend William Barber's movement is one of the most exciting developments politically today. And he's really stressing this idea of fusion, of the connection between, of a coalition of people with shared interests in economic justice and also racial justice. And the only thing I would do is I would push that a little bit, because we're used to this rhetoric of shared interests. I want to shift to a rhetoric of inextricable interests, because the point is not just that poor people ought to form a coalition across race lines. The point is that race has been the principal divide and conquer weapon to get poor people to fight each other and to get many poor people to hand over power to the very rich. So there will be no economic justice without cross-racial solidarity. And there will be no racial justice unless we can convince people, unless we can convince a significant number of whites that their future depends on racial justice too, right? That it's not, it's a complete inextricable fusion.
Yes, you referred to Clinton. We mustn't forget that Reagan ran against the welfare queen. Absolutely. Bush Sr. ran against Willie Horton, and the Clintons, because they said buy one, get two, the Clintons tried to Willie Hortonize Sister Soldier. So he tried to run against a black woman when his poll numbers were low, and apparently that helped him. So we shouldn't forget about Sister Soldier. Much of the hip-hop generation was very disappointed with Barack Obama, and Barack Obama told me all I needed to know about him, although as a liberal, of course, I wasn't going to disagree with everything he did, as his being a liberal, I should say. All I needed to know about him was when he refused to go to Memphis to commemorate the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King. Hillary went, even John McCain went, but Obama refused to go. That's all I needed to know. My question is, both the alt-right and then a certain Northeast Coast professor, which I don't want to dignify by naming him, what I came to realize was the alt-liberal white racist both rail against so-called identity politics. And one thing I think is important, and I try to tell my journalist friends this without much success, is that you need to ask these people what they mean by identity politics. The alt-right and the alt-liberal white racist, I'll go ahead and say his name, headed by Mark Lilla of Columbia University, have blamed minorities, oppressed minorities, for Democrats not being able to win elections. The November 2017 special elections, I would say, roundly refuted his position on that. But I'm wondering what all of you think about this racist, whether it comes from the right or the left, conception of identity politics as minorities only being parochially interested in their own group to the exclusion of anything else.
Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in. Sorry. Go ahead. I mean, I've written that for me it's a mistake, this argument that's emerged, both that Democrats and liberals in general should abandon what is categorized as identity politics, which is often presented as either kind of frivolous issues that college students are interested in, or as issues that systematically ignore the real concerns of broad portions of the Democratic Party. It's just a huge mistake, because really what we're talking about are issues that have defined the party and animated the party for a long time now, from civil rights to feminism, to environmentalism, to LGBT issues. All of these issues are not some side concern that the party has latched onto. And I think at a very practical, hard-headed look at this kind of argument, I don't think it would actually work. I think you'd end up alienating huge parts of the Democratic Party and demoralizing them rather than winning over many votes. And I think the point that these concerns and economic concerns are not somehow separate, they're totally intertwined, has been really an essential argument for some of the more successful moments in Democratic politics, whether it's the 1930s or early 1960s. So I just think it's off. I think it's the wrong argument. I'm not going to characterize it as necessarily a racist argument, but it's certainly a mistaken argument. And I think it's downplaying some of the more important changes that we've been talking about since '68, actual advances in political activism and political ideology that the Democrats have put forward.
I should say as though there's not a white male identity politics.
True.
Well, I think that there, I think there is, but I just want to add to that. I think part of this issue, I think, is we've seen mainstreaming of academic language, and it's getting picked up and misused, right? So when Kimberly Crenshaw talks about identity politics and intersectionality, right? She's not talking about, okay, well, you need to cater to each group based on their identity, right? And that's doing identity politics, right? She's talking about how our identities, our social positions, right, that put us within particular social structures that impact the quality of our lives. And if we are going to engage in a politics of identity, right, we're going to contend with the ways in which those social structures impact our lives. So it's not just about, oh, okay, well, this is the black contingent, let's cater to them, right? It's like, let's think about blackness as a social position. What are the ways in which inequality and these other things are being perpetuated, and how things like gender or class modify that, right? And how do we develop policy, right, and other kinds of practice that can alleviate that inequality. So I think that that's part of the problem, is that there is a gross misunderstanding of what identity politics are, what intersectionality is.
And if I could just jump in real quickly too, I think those criticisms of identity politics stem from a really misinformed, if just absolutely erroneous understanding of the development of US capitalism, as if you could somehow still ask the question, is it race or class, right? Increasingly, if you really meditate on that question, for an academic to pose it is a form of malpractice. I mean, it doesn't quite make sense, right? Especially if you understand the history of the plantation in US society. And if I could just also quickly jump in, and I think this is also why it's important for us to understand solidarity and social movements in very particular ways. You know, I often get impatient with a lot of my activist friends who say we got to move beyond the black and white paradigm. What does that mean? It doesn't make any sense because, again, it stems from a misinformed understanding of the development of US capitalism. The question isn't, do we move beyond the black and white paradigm, but rather, was the black and white paradigm always just that, right?
Yeah.
So I would say, look, something important is happening with this phrase identity politics, and a lot of what's been said is exactly right, that, you know, there are the sort of misapprehensions and assumptions and false claims of objectivity. But here's this other dynamic that we have to be very clear about. Among liberal political elites who are white, there's a developing consensus that you can't talk about race or about gender or about LGBTQ issues or about human rights generally without alienating the white working class vote. And so what they're looking for is a way to reach out to non-college educated whites without losing them, and they worry that if they say things like racism and sexism and homophobia, they'll lose those voters. And so they say, okay, we can't do identity politics, let's engage in economic populism because economics is something we can all agree on. And I think that for all the reasons that have been laid out by the panel, there's no way that you can separate those two. There's a tremendous amount of identity politics going on. Once you say we need to reach out to the white working class, you've said we need to engage in identity politics. But I think that another way to respond to that is to say, if you lead with a language of racism and sexism, you will in fact lose a lot of non-college educated white men. But those same individuals understand better the language of divide and conquer politics. They understand better that they too can be victimized if they vote their sexism or if they vote their racism. And that provides a wedge, an opening, a sort of a moment of self-interest when you can say to people, we need to address racism, we need to address sexism because it's the greatest tool for turning working people against each other and for encouraging working people to hand over their power to conservatives, right? And so I think we need to say to the sort of democratic pundits, it's just wrong to suppose that we have to choose between talking to people who are concerned about human rights and talking to people talking to the white working class. We can talk to them both, but we ought to do it with the language of divide and conquer politics.
Thank you all for being here. My name is William Walker, and I'm a third year here. I'm studying urban studies. I brought my mom, who's here in the audience,
Hi, Mom.
who moved here in 1969, which was a year after this report and 2 years after the riots where she lived in Newark, New Jersey. And she moved here to, correct me if I'm wrong, to create a better life for her children. Granted, I wasn't alive in that, what? Oh, well. So I guess she was creating a better life for herself.
Yes.
All right. But my point for bringing my mom to this is that I think that when you look at the situation that a lot of families are in that are African American 50 years from then, is that we're all in the same economic space that we were 50 years ago, if not worse. I'm sorry, this is my question's changed 3 times since I've stood here. Because I live this, and it's not like I can just sit and look at it from an academic lens. I go to classes here on campus that look at race issues where we talk about redlining and the different phenomena that came out of our White House to regulate people of color and to keep them in certain neighborhoods. And when we talk about it here, you know, the future planners of America, because people that come out of this institution are planners throughout this country. We talk about it from an academic lens. And it's very difficult for an academic, especially because most academics don't look like me, because most academics had to graduate from 8 years of college to be in the positions that they're in. This becomes an exercise where I'm not 50 yet, but I'm sure that this is the same debate that was happening 50 years ago. And so my question to you respectfully is, how do we move forward intersectionally with a term that was coined for black women that brought everyone else along, but black women are still at the bottom?
Yeah.
And it's like when I bring these perspectives to my classrooms here, I'm often told to keep them to myself, and I'm told that as a mature student, because I dropped out of this school 15 years ago and I'm back, but as a mature student, I have to understand that my perspectives, you know, aren't going to necessarily be well received by my classmates, and that, you know, you just got to hang in there. And why don't you do this extra credit work and do this stuff outside of class, and that'll help keep you interested. And so then you end up with like a 20-unit load when you're just trying to make it like everyone else in the society. So that's my question for you all. I don't know if you can parse it.
Oh, it's a great question.
I hope you don't park it.
No, thank you. Thank you so much.
And I was going to add to that, because Will's a brilliant scholar on campus, but
This is my classmate, by the way. We take a race and planning class, and we're lit.
yeah, we're lit. But also to add to that, like with the work y'all do, because a lot of this is state-based social science, and this conversation has been about the historiography of the state and the historiography of administrations. And so particularly with Shantel and Eric, I want to think about how you're thinking beyond the state in terms of interventions, because I'm thinking about Hunter's Point 1966 rebellion, and Hunter Point still looks the exact same that it did 50 years ago. And so really there's an annihilation of space and time, and like literally there's like zombies in our communities because they're actually still thinking through what happened 50 years ago. So how are y'all thinking through the erotic? How are y'all thinking through, you know, gentrification? Because it's a really intense problem, because it seems like people are like stuck in time.
And your name is?
And my name's Kirby, but I mean, yeah. But you know, like, we just stuck in time, and I just want to answer that. Yeah, think through that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to start?
Sure. It's a great question. I'll just pick up on the last point around the remedies that the Kerner Commission points to are all state-based and state and private sector-based. And that's the limit of, you know, so in some ways, the Kerner Commission is the height of racial liberalism, but it's also its limit. And I think the thing that is not often discussed in tandem with the Kerner Commission is the Black Panther Party, which is taking off in 66, 67. Here we are in the East Bay, and what better place to invoke them? And what are they engaged in 67, 68? They're engaged in survival programs, creating alternatives to state solutions. And this is really drawing more of the attention of, I think, the African-American activists and protesters who took to the streets in Newark and Detroit during that year, even though the New York Times reading crowd is reading the Kerner Commission report, you know, and it becomes a national bestseller. The Panthers have the attention of this whole other group of folks who are building alternative institutions. So I think that's a lesson that we need to draw on moving forward as well. 50 years later, I think that lesson is still relevant.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I think where we're kind of stuck with this, right, are what are the pragmatic, right, so-called feasible, right, solutions versus, right, the utopic things, right, that will help us all to get free, right, like our liberation is seen as this kind of utopic thing we perhaps can envision, but how do we actually go about doing it? And so I think that perhaps, right, there has to be a way maybe to do both of these things, right? So, you invoke Black Panther Party, right? So things like, the community kitchens, various kinds of community work that's being done. You have right now a group of folks in Detroit, right, who are taking over vacant lots and they're starting their own bee keeping, like co-ops or things like that. Things like community gardens, various other kinds of things. I think that there are ways to engage in kind of rebuilding community, revitalizing neighborhoods, right, that start from the community, right, doing that work. But I think we also, right, to the point that you point out, right, we also need, right, people who understand these particular, right, positions in the world, right, to be the ones who are making the decisions about how we build our cities, right? If you don't have Black and brown and women and mothers and queer people, et cetera, right, in the room, figuring out, right, okay, where are we going to put various kinds of transit, all right, so that we don't design cities around people being able to get to work in the morning and get home from work and not be able to get around the city in the meantime, right? So we don't, not put things like sidewalks and bike lanes, right, in lower income communities where mostly people of color live, but we'll make sure that those things go in more affluent areas, right, so that people can, right, rely on other modes of transportation. The way to make sure that those things happen on a city, state, national level is we need people in the room. And so the way that we get people in the room is people have to stick it out. And I completely understand that. My parents were Marines. I'm first gen. I get it. It's been a long road. And, I also, right, kind of have to contend with the ways in which, for a lot of my students, I'm the first Black professor that they've ever had in many years of being in school. I'm one of the few Black professors, if any, that they've had at the graduate level, right? And so there's a lot of this extra work that I'm having to do, right, to help not only, right, teach them things, right, but also to, support them so that they can finish this journey and that they can be in the room. But we also can't rely on just hoping that people get in the room, because there's all of these things that are built in to make sure that we don't get access to the room. So I think we need to be doing multi-pronged approaches. So yeah, I don't think we should just focus on state solutions. I think they're one of many solutions, because, right, this is the world we have to live in, right? It's one thing to be anti-capitalist, anti-racist, all of these things, right, and have these politics, and it's another to live in the world, right? You need money. You need money to eat. And so what are the ways, right, we can work within these structures, right, to possibly make change, but also work outside of them? I think it's important to do both of those things.
Or hold them accountable.
Hold on. So we are now at the point where we're under 3 minutes. We're closer to 2.5 minutes until we have to end. So I'm going to invite a very quick question that begins with a question and ends with a question mark. And then I'm going to give an opportunity to all of the panelists to use the response or some purported response as an opportunity to offer any last thoughts.
I just wanted to pick up on the criminalization and mass incarceration talk, and I was curious what your thoughts were on the Kerner Commission's thoughts on the rise of a garrison state and the permanent militarization and occupation of police and military in Black communities.
Thank you.
Did we want to get
Julian, do you want to come in?
Sure. It's already in the report, and it's some of the language they use in the report about what's happening in policing is a response to changes the Johnson administration had undertaken, which was putting more resources into arming the police, into giving military weaponry to local police forces. It's very reminiscent of what's going on today, and you could see the seeds of what's going to happen there. Elizabeth Hinton has a terrific book out that looks at the other side of the Johnson administration. Actually, it doesn't start with Richard Nixon. It actually starts with Johnson himself. And so a Kerner Report is already picking up on this kind of garrison state that's going on in the cities. I would just close kind of one thought that there have been some kinds of progress since 1968, and some of them have involved the state. I'd start earlier than 68. but certainly the Voting Rights Act of '65, the Civil Rights Act of '64, the creation of Medicaid were significant. And ultimately, I think while we want to focus on alternative forms of activism and support, ultimately state intervention will be necessary, and at a pretty massive level. And I think it's going to be important to keep the struggle to change the direction of politics at the state level, meaning the big state, because the kinds of interventions we saw in the early 60s will be necessary if we're ever seriously going to address the concerns raised in '68 by the Kerner Report.
Great. Eric?
So to answer the last question, I think that if we were to look at the pieces of the Kerner Commission report that actually did get implemented, unfortunately, or it's the ones that deal with policing and the depopulation of the ghetto. I mean, that's debatable, but it seems to me like this part that no one ever really talks about is the part that actually gets mobilized by the state. But, you know, don't want to necessarily end on that note. So I think what I would say is to invoke Secretary Donovan's point about the suburbanization of poverty and how a lot of these issues are moving to the outlying areas. I think that we probably need to focus our energies if, you know, to the extent that state interventions like the ones that the Kerner Commission proposed, that we need to focus on how to build these movements and these interventions in new geographies of opportunity. And I think that is, you know, in the outlying areas, for better or for worse. And so I would just, you know, want to move the discussion from the so-called inner city to the outer areas where you know, more people of color are moving, where poverty is growing at an exponential rate.
And I would just say two things. First, I think what the Kerner Commission failed to realize was that the issue of racial justice wasn't just an issue for communities of color. And we see now more clearly than ever before, I think, that the issue of race is a defining issue for all of society. And nobody, so it's not just the state, it's not just a culture, it's our democracy, our society. Racism, I think, is the central issue of our time. And the second thing I want to say is, thank you all very much. I think you've been a wonderful audience and a fantastic panel. Julian, Shantel, Eric, thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking the panel.